Let's think back to Manifest Destiny and what that meant for America. Thomas Jefferson and others in his era had the idea that the United States of America would eventually, which started out as 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard of the current United States, the country would eventually make its way all the way west across North America to the Pacific Ocean. And we did. We won our war for independence and basically tripled the size of our country, expanding to the Great Lakes all the way to the Mississippi River. And then in 1803, Louisiana purchased. We purchased that vast tract of land that is essentially the western drainage system of the Mississippi River. And then, of course, the Mexican Cession, when we fought a war with Mexico and we basically gained what is now presently the American Southwest, in the Gadsden Purchase a few years after that. Manifest Destiny was the belief that the United States would eventually not just move west, but we would bring with it American prosperity and economic growth. It didn't end there. In the 1890s, Americans, especially in the era of the Panic of 1893, were looking to expand economically. And while, the United States had moved from coast to coast in North America, the lower 48, there were other reasons out there for the United States to consider expanding elsewhere. And as you now have more ready markets to trade with Asia, specifically China, there is reason to believe that you could potentially grow. Furthermore, European powers at the time had become heavily involved in Asian expansion, economically speaking. In order for the United States to keep up, or perhaps even move ahead from an economic standpoint, the United States was going to have to start competing in Asian markets so as to build economic prosperity even further and build somewhat of an imperial mindset. Well, how do you do that? You have to have influence in the South Pacific or elsewhere in the Pacific if you're going to become bigger and an economic player in the Pacific. How do you gain influence? How do you protect your resources? How do you expand? Okay. So you might be able to send ships and hope that they do their best, like in colonial days where American ships would go back and forth to England, and after the war you hope that they're not taken over by British vessels and the sailors there are impressed into the British Navy. You would hope stuff like that doesn't happen. In order for America to take its new steps towards Manifest Destiny, the new Manifest Destiny, expansion into the South Pacific and Asia as well as economic trade posts, you would have to wield large authority on the open sea. You would need to have an influence with ships that could trade. But if you are going to trade and have merchant growth on the open seas, you're going to have to protect your trade. Might there be an organization who could really help protect American trade vessels and American interests around the world on the high seas? Can you guys think of an organization who might be geared specifically for that? Yes, the United States Navy. Anchors aweigh, boys. Yes. The United States Navy had been in existence, but it was largely fledgling until this time. Those with the idea that we would expand territorially from an economic standpoint into the South Pacific believed that we would need a strong naval presence in order to protect our interests abroad on the high seas. It was deemed in this era that we would begin building ships and commit to having a strong navy. You look at the United States Navy today, it is far and away the best Navy in the world. Okay? I love the Navy. The Navy, we have the most advanced ships, submarines, destroyers, fighters, fighter bombers, aircraft carriers, sailors, commanders. You have a wonderful Navy that is exceptionally mobile, and they are exceptionally capable. They can protect our interests in matter of seconds anywhere around the world and under any condition. And then when you add to the Navy, you have naval infantry, also known as Marines, who can be deployed from naval ships anywhere around the world on a moment's notice for any reason to secure a situation and pull back out. America's Navy, and by default the Marine Corps, are an integral aspect in American prosperity. Okay? They are the very best in the world at what they do. They had to have their start somewhere in order to get to where they are. Remember, I said America's Navy was very fledgling before this era. But we would commit, based on our idea of expanding our economic assets and trade in the Southern Pacific, we would expand our protections. We would protect our assets. We would protect American interests abroad. And it was during this era that the United States Navy really gained prominence. Now, if you're going to have merchant ships and even naval ships abroad, there are going to need to be docking stations and weigh stations that would weigh product, refueling, resupply. The Pacific Ocean is vast. It is by far the largest ocean in the world. That's not even close. The next closest would be the Atlantic, which is like a third the size of the Pacific. The Pacific is vast. You can look at the Pacific Ocean. Here's the Eastern Pacific, and over there's the Western Pacific. Or rather, there's the Eastern Pacific, and there's the Western. I got those mixed up. It's a little backwards. Sorry about that. Okay? Here's the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, if you were to put this in a globe, the Atlantic Ocean's big, but it's nowhere near as big as the Pacific. Okay? But here's the United States, and then over here, you've got to build influence in the South Pacific. But also, right there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean are these islands. Weather's great on those islands. Oh, they're right smack in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That would be incredibly useful if you're trading with Asia or the South Pacific. How about we build way stations and perhaps have trading posts on these islands? This island nation that we know as Hawaii existed. And even going back to the late 1700s, you would have American sugar plantations that would be built on these islands under agreement of native Hawaiians that would eventually somewhat dilute native Hawaiian influence in that particular territory. And kind of like with Native Americans, you would see European diseases wreak havoc on native populations there in Hawaii. And you saw somewhat of a dilution of Hawaiian Polynesian culture as well. Because within those sugar plantations, you would need to bring labor, and largely you have folks from mainland Asia who would be far willing to do it, more so than perhaps native Hawaiians. And that became a very large point of contention, and Hawaii would basically bring up a new monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, to basically stand up to some of these American imperialists. The problem was America had ingrained so much by way of sugar plantations, sugar growth, American business and economic influence, division among native Hawaiians themselves, loss of clout that they had, and then of course American trading posts in Hawaii. Eventually, American planters gathered enough power to where they lobbied Washington, D.C. to eventually pass annexation. And so Hawaii, during this era in the 1890s, would be annexed into the United States as a territory. it was not until the 1950s that Hawaii would become an official state. So it was during this time Hawaii was deemed as a vital aspect for annexation because of its location. Similarly, you have the American Samoas right around here in the South Pacific that were deemed also necessary. Germany and Britain at the time had major trading posts in that area, and as they were very viable, it was deemed as necessary for the for the Samoas to be aligned with the United States. So the United States agreed to having a protectorate over the Samoas, and eventually most of the Samoas that you see here would be split among European powers and the United States. So you have the territories of the American Samoas to this day that are populated. Those are American citizens in the Samoas over here. So now you have viable trading posts in Hawaii and the Samoas to where you can more readily influence trade with Asia, therefore gain and grow economic power and influence throughout the world. And of course, you have a vibrant navy that is now going to take place as one of the top 5 navies of the world. And after a future conflict, they'll be one of the top 3. And even after more conflicts, they will be and remain the best navy in the world.